They say the ocean is a graveyard that never speaks, that once a ship goes under, the silence is absolute. But in 1945, in the cold grey waters south of Japan, the ocean did not stay silent. It screamed. This is the story of the Yamato. To the world she was a monster, a 70,000-ton fortress of invincible steel, armed with guns that could hurl a car over a mountain. She was the pride of an empire, a floating palace where officers dined on steak while the nation starved. But that was the lie. The truth was a machine built on paranoia, a weapon so expensive it was too valuable to use, and a crew trapped inside a tragedy that was written before the keel was even laid. Tonight we are going to peel back the layers of rust and history. We are going to go beyond the battle maps and into the sweat and fear of the engine rooms. We are going to find out why 3,000 men were sent on a one-way voyage to nowhere, and why the world refused to listen to what they left behind. So settle in. The water is rising, and the story of the end is about to begin. Imagine for a moment the sound of the ocean, not the rhythmic, soothing crash of waves on a beach that we play to help us sleep, but the other ocean, the deep ocean, the one that is indifferent to human life. It is a vast, grey silence, a silence that has swallowed wooden galleons and steel destroyers alike for thousands of years. But on the afternoon of April 7th, 1945, 150 miles southwest of Kyushu, the ocean did not sound like silence, it sounded like a scream. The sound did not come from the surface, it came from below. It was a noise so loud, so unnatural, that sailors on nearby destroyers, men who were already deafened by the roar of anti-aircraft fire and the thunder of exploding torpedoes, later reported feeling it vibrate through the soles of their boots. It was the sound of air being murdered by water. Deep inside the armored belly of the largest battleship ever built, the lights had gone out. The emergency lamps flickered and died, leaving thousands of men in a darkness so absolute it felt heavy. These were the boiler rooms, the magazines, the steering compartments of the Imperial Japanese Navy's ship, the Yamato. The ship was rolling. It was listing to port, sliding inexorably onto its side. The horizon had become vertical, the floor had become a wall, and inside those steel compartments the air was running out. But it wasn't just running out. As the ocean rushed in through the torn steel plating, it compressed the air pockets trapped inside. The pressure built in milliseconds. The bulkheads, made of the thickest armor ever rolled by human hands, began to groan, and then they began to fail. The men trapped inside didn't just drown. They were crushed by the collapsing architecture of their own invincible machine. The sound that escaped the ship, the sound that traveled through the water and was heard by the escort vessels drifting away from the wreck, was a mixture of tearing metal and the final collective exertion of a crew that realized all at once that the myth was ending. When the bow of the Yamato finally dipped beneath the waves, it didn't just slip away. It was sucked down. A vortex of water, oil, and debris swirled over the spot where 72,000 tons of imperial ambition had stood moments before. And then came the silence. But before we can understand the horror of that final afternoon, and before we can understand why thousands of men were willing to lock themselves inside a sinking steel coffin, we have to go back. We have to understand how a nation convinces itself that it can build a god out of rivets and steel. We have to understand why this ship had to exist, and why, from the very moment the first line was drawn on a blueprint, it was already doomed. This is not just the story of a ship. This is the story of a fear so profound that it required the largest machine in history to hide it. To understand the Yamato, we cannot start in the shipyards of the 1930s. We must start in the smoke-filled conference rooms of 1922. The First World War had ended. The world was exhausted. The great powers, Britain, the United States and Japan, gathered in Washington, D.C. to sign a treaty. The goal was noble, to prevent another arms race, to stop the endless construction of battleships that drained national treasuries and made war inevitable. The Washington Naval Treaty was signed with handshakes and smiles. It set a ratio. For every 5 tons of battleships the Americans and British were allowed to have, Japan was allowed 3, 553. To the Western powers this seemed fair. Japan was a smaller island nation. It had one ocean to patrol, not 2 or 3. But to the naval officers of the Empire of Japan, this was not a treaty. It was an insult. It was a diplomatic slap in the face that echoed across the Pacific. In the psyche of the Japanese Imperial Navy, the number 3 became a symbol of subjugation. They believed the West was trying to keep them permanently inferior, a second-rate power destined to live in the shadow of the American eagle and the British lion. They walked out of those conference rooms with polite bows, but in their hearts they carried a cold, hard resolve. If they could not outnumber the American fleet, they would have to outclass it. If they could not build more ships, they would build one ship that was worth 5 of the enemy's. The logic was seductive. It was the logic of the underdog who brings a knife to a fistfight, only to realize the other side has brought a gun. So Japan decided to build a cannon so large, so powerful, that the rules of the treaty would simply shatter against its hull. They called this doctrine quality over quantity. But it was more than military strategy. It was a national coping mechanism. Japan had spent 50 years racing to catch up with the West, modernizing at a breakneck speed that dislocated its culture and traumatized its people. They had defeated Russia in 1905, shocking the world, but they still felt looked down upon. They needed a symbol. They needed something physical, something tangible. That proved they were not just equals, but superiors. And so, in the late 1920s, inside the high-security offices of the Navy Technical Department in Tokyo, the dreaming began. They didn't want a battleship. They wanted a fortress that could move. They wanted a weapon that would make the American fleet look like toys in a bathtub. But there was a problem of physics. To build a ship that can destroy anything else afloat, you need guns. Big guns. The standard battleship gun of the era was 16 inches in diameter. A shell from a 16-inch gun weighs about as much as a small car. It can punch through 18 inches of steel armor from miles away. The Americans had 16-inch guns. The British had 16-inch guns. Japan decided to go bigger. 18.1 inches, 46 centimeters. It sounds like a small difference, 2 inches. But in the world of ballistics, the difference is exponential. The shell from an 18-inch gun weighs 3,200 pounds. It is the weight of a luxury sedan filled with high explosives, fired at 1.5 times the speed of sound. The engineers looked at the math, and the math terrified them. To fire a gun that size, the ship has to be massive. If the ship is too light, the recoil from the guns will tear the structural beams apart. The ship will literally shake itself to pieces. So, to carry the guns, you need a hull that is wider, deeper, and heavier than anything ever attempted. But a heavier ship is slower. To make a heavy ship move at 30 knots, the speed required to catch an American carrier, you need engines of monstrous power. You need boilers that consume rivers of oil. And to protect those engines, you need armor plate that is 16 inches thick, which adds more weight, which requires more engine power. It is a vicious cycle. The super battleship design grew and grew on the drafting tables. It consumed the minds of Japan's best naval architects. Captain Keiji Fukuda, a brilliant, obsessive designer, went through 23 different blueprints. Some were too slow, some were too poorly armored, some were simply impossible to build with the technology of the day. But there was another layer to this design, one that speaks to the paranoia of the time. The entire project was classified top secret. This wasn't just standard military secrecy. This was an existential secret. The Japanese Navy knew that if the Americans found out about the 18-inch guns, they would simply build their own. The advantage would be lost. The Yamato had to be a surprise. It had to be a revelation that would appear on the horizon and shock the enemy into submission before the first shell was even fired. So, they lied. In all official documentation, the guns were listed as 40 centimeters, roughly 16 inches. Special victories of engineering were invented to explain why the barrels looked so large. Misinformation was leaked to foreign attachés. The deception was baked into the blueprints themselves. The engineers were not just designing a machine, they were designing a puzzle, a riddle wrapped in steel, intended to confuse the world until it was too late. Finally, in March 1937, the design was finalized. It was designated A140F6. It would be 862 feet long. It would displace nearly 72,000 tons when fully loaded. twice the size of the typical battleships fighting in Europe. It would carry the largest guns ever made. They named her Yamato. The name itself was a statement. Yamato is not just a region in Japan. It is the poetic, ancient name for Japan itself. It signifies the spiritual heart of the empire. By naming the ship Yamato, they were declaring that this vessel was the nation incarnate. If the ship stood, Japan stood. If the ship fell, well, that was a possibility they refused to entertain. Construction began on November 4, 1937, at the Kure Naval Arsenal. Kure was a city defined by the Navy, a landscape of cranes, dry docks, and smoke. But the construction of hull number 1 was different. Usually when a keel is laid, there is a ceremony. There are prayers, sake, and speeches, but Yamato began in the shadows. The dry dock where she was to be built was deepened, specifically so that when the hull rose up, it would sit lower in the ground, hidden from prying eyes. But the physical walls of the dry dock weren't enough. The Navy feared spies. They feared American reconnaissance planes. They feared the loose tongues of the workers. So they built a cage. Enormous fences were erected around the dry dock, but these weren't just fences. They were walls of galvanized steel, topped with barbed wire. Where the view was still open to the nearby hills, they hung massive curtains made of sisal rope. Imagine that image, a mountain of hemp and straw hanging from the sky, weaving a basket around a monster. The police presence in Kure was suffocating. Military police, the Kempitai, patrolled the perimeter 24 hours a day. Train windows passing the shipyard were shuttered. Passengers were ordered to look away. If you were caught taking a photograph in the direction of the harbor, you were arrested, beaten, and your camera was destroyed. The locals learned to walk with their heads down. They knew something big was happening, something terrible and grand, but they learned that survival meant not knowing. Inside the yard, the secrecy was even more intense. The blueprints were cut in half. No single engineer, except for the very top brass, was allowed to see the entire design. One team worked on the bow, another on the stern, neither knowing how the two halves connected. Workers were strip-searched entering and leaving the facility. They swore oaths of silence signed in blood. To speak of what they saw inside the rope curtains was treason, punishable by death. And so, the ship grew in the dark. It is difficult to convey the sheer scale of the labor involved. We talk about industry, but we forget the sweat. We forget the heat. Building Yamato required the labor of thousands of men working in shifts day and night for 3 years. In the late 1930s, welding technology was still new. While some parts of Yamato were welded, millions of rivets were still used to hold the massive armor plates together. Riveting is brutal, deafening work. A rivet is a red-hot metal pin. It is tossed, literally thrown with tongs, from a furnace man to a catcher, who inserts it into a hole. Then a man with a pneumatic hammer pounds it flat, while another man on the other side braces against the impact. The noise inside the dry dock was a constant rhythmic thunder. It was the heartbeat of a beast coming to life, but it was a dangerous heartbeat. The armor plates of the Yamato were the thickest ever made. Some weighed as much as a locomotive. Moving them required cranes that had to be specially reinforced. When a chain snapped or a cable slipped, there was no mercy. Men died building the Yamato. We don't know exactly how many. The records of industrial accidents were scrubbed, just like the specifications of the guns. A broken body was an inconvenience to the schedule. A death was a hush-hush affair, a condolence payment to a family, a stern warning to say nothing. The ship was consuming lives before it ever touched the water. There is a superstition among sailors that a ship which kills its builders is cursed. It has a taste for blood. Whether the engineers at Kure believed in ghosts is irrelevant. They were building a machine designed to kill. If it started with its own creators, perhaps that was just a sign of its potency. As the hull rose, it became a landscape of its own. It was a city of steel. The internal volume was so vast that new workers frequently got lost in the labyrinth of corridors and compartments. There were over 1,000 watertight compartments. There were elevators. There were air conditioning systems, a luxury unheard of in the Japanese Navy, aimed at keeping the powder magazines cool, but which inadvertently made Yamato the most comfortable ship in the fleet. But the most striking feature, the one that the rope curtains tried so hard to hide, was the bow. Most ships have a straight bow or a raked bow that cuts through the water. Yamato was different. Her designers, led by the brilliant Yuzuru Hiraga, had discovered that a protruding bulb at the waterline reduced drag. It pushed the water aside before the main hull hit it. They gave Yamato a massive, bulbous nose, like a battering ram. It was hideous and beautiful all at once. It looked like the forehead of a whale or the snout of a prehistoric leviathan. It was a design born of pure mathematics, but in steel it looked like aggression. By the summer of 1940, the hull was complete. It was a brown, rusty mountain of metal sitting in a concrete canyon. The time had come to let the ocean in. The launch of a battleship is usually a moment of national pride. Bands play, champagne bottles are smashed. Politicians give speeches about glory and empire. The launching of the German battleship Bismarck, happening around the same time on the other side of the world, was a massive propaganda event, filmed for newsreels. But Yamato was born in silence. On August 8, 1940, the dry dock was flooded. There were no bands. There were no cheering crowds. The harbour was cleared of all non-essential traffic. The local police turned their backs to the sea. The workers stood at attention, silent. As the water rose, lifting the 70,000-ton keel from the blocks, there was a groan of settling metal. The displacement was so massive that it created a small tidal wave within the harbour basin. The water surged up the sea walls, flooding the feet of the few high-ranking officers who were there to witness it. The Yamato floated. She sat high in the water, light without her guns and fuel, but she was already imposing. She blocked out the sun. She cast a shadow that seemed to stretch all the way to Tokyo. But looking at her, drifting there in the quiet harbour, a few of the officers felt a chill. They had built the ultimate weapon. They had poured a significant percentage of the national economy into this single hull. They had sacrificed diplomatic relations, hidden the truth from their own people, and violated international law. And yet, looking at this floating fortress, they had to wonder, was it enough? The world was changing fast. In Europe, Germany was overrunning France with tanks and dive bombers. In the Atlantic, submarines were hunting in wolf packs. The age of the battleship, the age of heavy armor and big guns slugging it out in a line of battle, was it already fading? Had they built the greatest sword in history, just as the enemy was inventing gunpowder? The Yamato was towed to the fitting-out pier to receive her teeth, those massive 18-inch guns that had dictated her entire existence. The cranes lowered the turrets into place. Each turret weighed as much as an entire destroyer. The ship settled deeper into the water, inch by inch, as the weight of her destiny was loaded onto her back. This was the grand ambition. This was Act 1 of the tragedy. Japan had risen from the humiliation of the treaties, fueled by a desperate need for respect, and had birthed a monster. They believed that if they made it big enough, strong enough, and secret enough, reality would bend to their will. They were wrong. As 1940 turned to 1941 and the drums of war began to beat louder, the Yamato sat in Kure, a giant waiting to be woken. The workers who scrambled over her decks, installing the teak wood flooring and the polished brass fittings, whispered that she was unsinkable. They called her the savior of the empire. But a savior is only needed when there is something to be saved from. And the very existence of the Yamato, and the mindset that created her, was driving Japan toward a cliff. They had built a hammer, and now everything looked like a nail. The tragedy of the Yamato is not that she sank. Ships sink. The tragedy is that she was built for a world that no longer existed. She was a monument to the past, sailing into a future that had no place for her. But for now, in the quiet waters of the inland sea, she is still perfect. She is pristine. Her paint is fresh. Her hull is unscarred. The screams of 1945 are still 5 years away. The men who will die in her belly are currently walking the streets of Osaka and Tokyo, kissing their wives, holding their children, unaware that their tomb has already been built. The machine is ready, the stage is set, and the curtain is about to rise on the most violent war in human history. The Yamato is no longer just a blueprint. She is a reality, and reality is a cruel master. To understand the tragedy of the Yamato, you must first understand the paradox of her existence. We look at black and white photographs of the ship, and we see a weapon. We see the bristling anti-aircraft guns, the towering pagoda mast, the cold grey steel. But for the 3,000 men who lived inside her, Yamato was not just a weapon. It was a world. It was a floating city, complete with its own hierarchy, its own weather, and its own bizarre form of luxury. When a sailor was transferred to the Yamato from a destroyer or a cruiser, the first thing he noticed was the space. On a standard Japanese warship, men slept on the deck, or in hammocks slung so close together they bumped shoulders with every roll of the sea. They lived in grime and sweat. But Yamato was different. She was so large that she had wide corridors. She had legitimate bunks for the petty officers, and, most shockingly of all, she had air conditioning. The engineers had installed the cooling systems to keep the massive powder magazines from overheating and detonating the ship from the inside out. But the cool air was piped through the living quarters as well. In the sweltering heat of the South Pacific, where temperatures inside a destroyer could reach 120 degrees, Yamato remained a cool, dry 68 degrees. The food was legendary. While the rest of the Japanese army was beginning to starve, surviving on rice gruel and scavenged roots, the kitchens of the Yamato were serving steak. They had refrigerators big enough to walk into. They made their own lemonade, known as ramoon, bottled in glass with a marble stopper. They had a band that played jazz, quietly of course, in the officers' wardroom. This earned the ship a derisive nickname among the rest of the fleet. They didn't call her the flagship. They called her Hotel Yamato. There is a bitter irony in this. The sailors on the destroyers, baking in the sun, looked at the giant silhouette of the Yamato and felt a mix of envy and contempt. They saw her as a holiday resort for the elite, but they couldn't see what was happening inside the hearts of the men who lived there. Luxury in wartime is a kind of poison. It breeds guilt. The crew of the Yamato knew they were the best-fed, best-housed men in the empire, and they knew they had done absolutely nothing to earn it. They were trapped in a gilded cage. They scrubbed the teak decks until they were white. They polished the brass until it looked like gold. They ran drills until they could load the main guns in their sleep, but they did not fight. The ship was too valuable to risk. This is the curse of the superweapon. When you build something that embodies the soul of your nation, you become terrified of scratching the paint. So Yamato sat at anchor. She sat in the lagoon at Truk. She sat in the harbor at Kur. She became a fixture of the landscape, a steel mountain that never moved. But deep within the ship, far below the air-conditioned officers' quarters, there was a different reality. This was the domain of the invisible army, the engineers, the stokers, the damage control teams. Down here there was no luxury. Down here there was only noise and heat. The Yamato was powered by 12 massive boilers, driving 4 steam turbines. The roar was deafening. It was a physical weight that pressed against the chest. The men who worked in these compartments were a different breed. They were pale, rarely seeing the sun. They lived in a world of oil grease and steam valves, and their training was disturbing. In the Japanese Navy, damage control, the art of keeping a sinking ship afloat, was not just about patching holes. It was about calculation. It was about sacrifice. The engineers were drilled on a procedure called counter-flooding. If the ship was hit by torpedoes on the port side, she would list. If she listed too far, she would capsize. To stop this, the engineers had to intentionally flood the compartments on the starboard side. They had to pump thousands of tons of seawater into their own ship to balance the weight. But the drill had a horrific component. The order to counter-flood had to be executed instantly. There was no time to evacuate the men inside those starboard compartments. The engineers were trained to open the valves and drown their own shipmates, and the men in those compartments were trained to accept it. Imagine that drill. Standing in a small steel room, watching a petty officer point to a valve, and knowing that in a real battle, your duty would be to stand there and wait for the water to hit the ceiling. They didn't practice escape. They practiced resignation. They rehearsed their own deaths in the service of keeping the gun platforms level. This was the culture inside the machine, a mix of surface luxury and deep structural fatalism. And while the crew polished the brass and rehearsed their suicides, The world outside was shifting. The premise that built the Yamato, the idea that big guns dominate the ocean, was dying. It happened quickly, and it happened from the sky. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese Navy proved to the world that battleships were obsolete. Their aircraft carriers struck Pearl Harbor, destroying the American battle line from the air. It was a masterstroke of aerial warfare, and yet the admiral who planned the attack, Isoroku Yamamoto, directed the war from the bridge of the Yamato. It is a striking image, the man who invented modern carrier warfare sitting on the bridge of a dinosaur. During the Battle of Midway in 1942, the turning point of the war, Yamato was there. She was the flagship. But she was hundreds of miles behind the carriers. She was too slow to keep up and too valuable to expose. Her crew stood on the deck and listened to the radio reports of the disaster. They heard that 4 Japanese carriers were burning. They heard the screams of the pilots. But they saw nothing. The Yamato fired no guns. She simply turned around and went home. The Hotel Yamato nickname began to sting. The crew felt the shame of it. They were the samurai who never drew their swords. As 1943 turned into 1944, the situation grew desperate. The Americans were island-hopping across the Pacific. Their production lines were churning out ships and planes at a rate that defied logic. For every ship Japan sank, America launched 3 more. And Yamato began to face a new enemy. Not the Americans, but the logistics of her own appetite. The Yamato was a glutton. At cruising speed, she burned tons of heavy fuel oil every hour. At combat speed, she drank rivers of it. But Japan was running out of oil. The American submarines had strangled the shipping lanes from the East Indies. The tankers were burning. The refineries were dry. The High Command looked at the Yamato and saw a liability. Moving the ship from one island to another consumed enough fuel to power a squadron of destroyers for a month. So she became a fleet in being, a strategic concept, where a ship is kept safe solely to threaten the enemy with its existence. She was a piece on a chessboard that was glued to the square. The officers paced the decks looking at the sky. They knew what was coming. They saw the American planes getting faster, carrying heavier bombs. They saw the sky darken with enemy formations. The Yamato had been refitted with more anti-aircraft guns, dozens of them, cluttering the beautiful clean lines of her deck. But the officers knew it was a bandage on a mortal wound. A battleship without air cover is just a target. By early 1945, the illusion was gone. The Philippines had fallen. Iwo Jima had fallen. The Americans were landing on Okinawa, the doorstep of the Japanese home islands. The atmosphere in Tokyo had shifted from strategy to fanaticism. Logic had left the room. The talk was no longer about how to win, but how to die beautifully. The Special Attack Corps, the Kamikaze, had begun crashing planes into American ships. It was a national cult of self-destruction. And in the naval headquarters, eyes turned to the Yamato. It was an uncomfortable conversation. The army was throwing thousands of men into the meat grinder of Okinawa. The Air Force was sending young boys in wooden planes to burn themselves alive. And yet, the Navy's greatest ship, the pride of the Empire, was sitting in the inland sea, safe, cool, and useless. The Emperor himself asked the question. During a briefing on the Okinawa defense, he looked at his admirals and asked, "What of the Navy? Are there no more ships?" It was a gentle question, but in the context of Imperial Japan, it was a death sentence. The Navy could not allow the Army and the Air Force to outdo them in sacrifice. They could not let the Yamato survive the war while the nation burned. It would be shameful. It would be cowardly. So the plan was hatched. It was called Operation 10-Go, the heavenly operation. The plan was simple, brutal, and strategically idiotic. Yamato, accompanied by a light cruiser and 8 destroyers, would sail to Okinawa. She would beach herself on the coast, literally drive the ship onto the sand. There she would act as an unsinkable artillery battery, firing her massive 18-inch guns at the American troops until her ammunition ran out. And then the crew would grab rifles and swords, storm the beach, and die fighting as infantry. There was no plan for return. There was no air cover provided. There were no carriers to protect her. It was a suicide mission on a scale of 70,000 tons. On April 5, 1945, the orders were delivered to the fleet at anchor in Mitajiri. The commanders of the escort ships were summoned to the Yamato. They gathered in the wardroom, surrounded by the polished wood and the soft lighting of the hotel. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, the commander of the task force, stood before them. Ito was a rational man. He had studied in the United States. He knew the industrial might of the enemy. He had opposed the war from the start, and now he had to order his men to die for a gesture. When the plan was read, the room erupted. The captains of the destroyers were furious. They were seasoned veterans. They knew the sea. They knew that without air cover, the American planes would swarm them before they got halfway to Okinawa. "This is not a battle," one captain shouted. "It is a slaughter." "Why throw away these ships?" asked another. "Let us raid the supply lines. Let us do something useful." The argument raged. It was a clash between the cold logic of warfare and the hot, irrational demand for honor. Admiral Ito let them speak. He let them vent their anger. He knew they were right. But then the Chief of Staff spoke the words that silenced the room. He explained that this was not a request from the Navy. It was the will of the Emperor. He explained that the special attack pilots were dying by the hundreds, and the surface fleet had to offer its own blood to match them. It was necessary for the spiritual survival of the nation. "We are being asked to die," he said, "to serve as the heralds of the passing of the Empire." The room went quiet. The anger drained away, replaced by a heavy, suffocating resolve. In the culture of that time and place, there was no argument against the Emperor's will. There was no argument against the need for a beautiful death. The captains stood up. They adjusted their uniforms, they bowed, and they accepted the death warrant. But there was one final, cruel detail: the fuel. Japan was so short on oil that there wasn't enough to fill Yamato's tanks. The logistics officers at the depot in Tokuyama were ordered to scrape the bottom of the barrels. They drained the storage tanks. They siphoned oil from other ships that were too damaged to sail. They managed to scavenge enough fuel for the trip to Okinawa, but they did not load enough for the trip back. Some accounts say that the depot commander, in a quiet act of defiance, secretly pumped a little extra oil into the tanks, enough that if by some miracle they survived, they could limp home. But the official paperwork was clear. One way. On the evening of April 5th, the Yamato prepared for her final voyage. The mood on board shifted. The hotel was closed. The luxury was stripped away. The crew was ordered to clear the ship of flammable materials. The beautiful teak decks, which they had scrubbed for years, were covered in sandbags. The wooden furniture from the officers' staterooms was hauled out and dumped unceremoniously onto the pier. The paintings, the carpets, the personal letters, everything that made the ship a home, was removed. The midshipmen, the young cadets who were still in training, were ordered off the ship. They were told to pack their bags and disembark. They stood on the pier, weeping, begging to be allowed to stay and die with their comrades. But the older sailors pushed them away. "You are the future," they were told. "We are the past." That night, a final party was held in the mess halls. It was a sake party. The Navy's reserves of alcohol were broken out. The strict discipline that governed life aboard the Yamato for 3 years was relaxed. Officers and enlisted men drank together. They sang songs. They sang the traditional Navy songs about cherry blossoms falling from the tree, beautiful, short-lived, and scattered by the wind. They wrote letters to their families. "Dear Mother," one sailor wrote, "please do not grieve. To die for the country is the greatest wish of a man. I will become a guardian spirit of the sea." Another wrote, simply, "I have done my duty. I am going to vanish." They cut locks of their hair and fingernails, wrapping them in small paper packets. These were to be left behind, so that their families would have something to bury. Because they knew, with absolute certainty, that their bodies would never be found. As the alcohol flowed, the fear began to show. Some men cried. Some sat in stony silence. Some laughed a little too loud. They were young men. The average age of the crew was barely 20 years old. They had grown up hearing that the Yamato was invincible. They had been told it was the ship that would save the world. Now they understood the truth. The ship wasn't going to save them. They were going to feed the ship. The next morning, April 6, 1945, the sun rose over the inland sea. It was a hazy, grey morning. The water was calm. The engines of the Yamato began to turn. The vibration started deep in the keel, a low hum that grew into a shudder. The anchor chain was winched up, dripping with mud. At 1500 hours, the task force moved out. The light cruiser Yahagi took the lead. The 8 destroyers fanned out in a protective screen. And in the center, the Yamato. As she passed through the Bungo Strait, leaving the sheltered waters of the inland sea and entering the open Pacific, the crew looked back at the coastline of Japan. They saw the green hills. They saw the fishing boats. For almost all of them, it was the last time they would ever see land. The ship picked up speed. The bow, that massive, bulbous bow designed to crush the ocean, cut through the waves. The wake stretched out behind her, a white scar on the dark water. But they were not alone. High above, miles in the sky, 2 American submarines, the Threadfin and the Hackleback, were watching. They saw the giant blip on their radar. They saw the silhouette against the horizon. They didn't attack. They didn't need to. They simply keyed their radios and sent a message to the American fleet gathering off Okinawa. Target spotted, heading southwest, speed 22 knots. The trap was sprung. The Americans knew she was coming. They had cracked the Japanese naval codes. They knew her course, they knew her speed, they knew she had no air cover. On the carriers of the U.S. Task Force 58, the pilots were running to their planes, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, hundreds of them. They were loading armor-piercing bombs. They were checking their machine guns. The Hotel Yamato was open for business, and the guests were on their way. Act 2 is over. The machine has been built, the myth has been established, and the illusion of safety has been shattered. The logic of war has been replaced by the logic of sacrifice. Now there is only the sea, the sky, and the inevitable collision between the two. The waiting is finished. The dying is about to begin. April 7th, 1945. The morning broke not with the golden light of hope, but with a suffocating grey. Low, heavy clouds hung over the East China Sea, pressing down on the water like a dirty ceiling. Rain squalls danced across the horizon, appearing as dark, bruised curtains against the slate-colored waves. On the bridge of the Yamato, the officers scanned the sky with binoculars until their eyes watered. The visibility was poor, shifting in and out of the mist. In a perverse way, this was their only shield. If the clouds stayed low, perhaps the American planes wouldn't find them. Perhaps the heavenly operation would buy a few more hours of life. But silence, out here, is a deception. Below decks, the mood had shifted from the drunken resolve of the night before to a cold, vibrating tension. The hangover of the sake party had faded, replaced by the metallic taste of adrenaline. 332 men were at their battle stations. In the gun tubs, the crews of the anti-aircraft guns checked their ammunition for the 100th time. They strapped themselves into their seats. They looked at the pictures of their families tucked into their helmets or taped to the gun shields. Deep in the bowels of the ship, in the engine rooms, the heat was rising. The boilers were roaring, pushing the ship to 24 knots, then 26. The vibration was constant. It rattled the teeth. It shook the dust from the overhead pipes. The men down there, the invisible army, checked the pressure gauges. They wiped their greasy hands on rags. They didn't look at each other. There was nothing left to say. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the first crack in the world appeared. The radar operator, hunched over his glowing green scope in a dark room, saw it, a splatter of light. It wasn't a ship. It was too fast. It wasn't a single plane. It was a cloud. "Large formation detected," he called out. His voice was steady, trained, but the words carried the weight of a tombstone. "Bearing south, range 60 miles. The report went up the chain of command. On the bridge, Admiral Ito listened. He nodded. He didn't issue a speech. He simply ordered the ship to Condition 1. The alarm sounded. It was a harsh, rhythmic buzzer that cut through every compartment of the ship. Bzz, bzz, bzz. The sound of the end beginning. At 12:32, the clouds to the south broke open. It didn't look like an attack at first. It looked like a pestilence. American planes swarmed out of the grey mist like insects disturbed from a hive. There were hundreds of them, Curtiss Helldivers, Avengers, Hellcats. They didn't fly in the neat, chivalrous formations of the early war. They came in loose predatory packs. They had taken off from the carriers of Task Force 58, the Hornet, the Bennington, the San Jacinto. The American pilots looked down and saw her. From 10,000 feet, the Yamato looked like a toy, but a dangerous toy. She was spitting fire. The order was given to open fire, and the Yamato exploded into noise. The main guns, those 18-inch monsters, were not designed for anti-aircraft fire, but desperation breeds invention. They fired Type 3 shells, the Sanshiki. These were essentially giant shotgun shells filled with incendiary tubes. When they detonated, they created massive cones of fire and smoke in the sky. They looked terrifying. They were designed to incinerate entire squadrons of planes, but to the American pilots, they were just fireworks. The planes danced through the smoke, untouched. The technology of the past was flailing against the technology of the future. The Type 3 shells damaged the barrels of the Yamato's own guns more than they damaged the enemy. Then the swarm descended. The Americans had a plan. They had been briefed. They knew that if they hit the Yamato on both sides, she would just settle lower in the water and keep fighting. She was too stable. To kill a giant, you have to make it fall over. So the orders were specific. Target the port side, only the port side. The first wave of dive bombers screamed down. They aimed for the decks. They weren't trying to sink her yet. They were trying to blind her. Bombs slammed into the superstructure. The radar room was pulverized. The aft secondary turret was blown apart, killing the crew instantly and sending a fireball rolling across the teak deck. The pristine white wood, covered in sandbags, was suddenly painted with oil, soot, and blood. But the real killers were low on the water. The torpedo bombers, the Avengers, came in just 20 feet above the waves. They were slow, ugly planes, but they carried the death blow. They dropped their torpedoes, long steel cylinders that splashed into the water and began their run. The Yamato, despite her size, tried to dance. The captain ordered a hard turn to port, then to starboard. The massive ship leaned, groaning, cutting a zigzag scar through the ocean. But she was 800 feet long. She couldn't dodge them all. At 12:45, the first torpedo hit. Wham! It struck the port bow. The explosion was muffled by the water, a dull, sickening thud that lifted the floorboards under the sailors' feet. A geyser of water shot up the side of the ship higher than the bridge, then another. Wham! And another. The water didn't trickle in. It roared. It came in with the force of a freight train. The outer air defense station was flooded instantly. The men there didn't have time to drown. They were pulverized by the pressure of the ocean entering their world at 40 miles an hour. The ship shuddered. And then she began to list. It was subtle at first, a 5-degree tilt to port. The horizon, viewed from the bridge, became slightly crooked. Pens rolled off tables. Men had to spread their legs to keep their balance. But the Americans weren't done. The first wave banked away, and the second wave was already diving. This is where the nightmare truly began. The Yamato was a fortress, but a fortress is only as strong as its ability to communicate. The bombs had severed the internal phone lines. The bridge could no longer speak to the damage control center. The damage control center could no longer speak to the engine rooms. The ship was being lobotomized. Down in the dark, the water was rising. The list increased. 5 degrees became 10, then 15. At 15 degrees, a ship the size of Yamato becomes difficult to operate. The anti-aircraft guns can't rotate fast enough because they are fighting gravity. The machinery begins to grind. The damage control officers knew the math. If the list reached 20 degrees, the ship would capsize. They had to level the ship. And they had only one way to do it: counter-flooding. They had to add weight to the starboard side, the high side, to pull the ship back down. But the tanks were not filling fast enough. The water was coming into the port side faster than they could pump water into the starboard side. The officer in charge looked at the schematic on the wall. He saw the only spaces large enough to hold the weight of water needed to save the ship. The starboard outer engine room and the starboard boiler rooms. There were men in there, the stokers, the engineers. The men who had been feeding the fires that kept the propellers turning. The men who had been working in the heat and noise for hours, unaware of exactly what was happening above. The order was given. There was no time to call them. The phones were dead. There was no time to send a runner. Every second the ship tilted further was a second closer to death for all 3,000 men. The valves were opened. Imagine the sound inside that engine room. The roar of the turbines is suddenly cut by the scream of water. It doesn't come from a leak. It comes from the vents, from the floor, from the pipes designed to cool the machinery. The ocean rushed into the hot compartment. When cold seawater hits a superheated boiler, it flashes into steam instantly. The room became a blinding white scalding fog. We don't know if they screamed. We don't know if they tried to climb the ladders. We only know that within minutes, the list stopped increasing. The ship groaned and slowly, painfully, levered herself back toward an even keel. The sacrifice had worked. The invisible army had paid the toll, but the respite was an illusion. The Americans saw the ship straighten up, and they took it as an invitation. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the third and final wave arrived. This was the execution. The Yamato was already limping. She was smoking. Her decks were a charnel house of twisted metal and bodies. Her speed had dropped to 10 knots. She was a sitting duck. The American pilots were merciless. They concentrated everything on the wounded port side. They wanted to finish it. Torpedo after torpedo slammed into the hull. The armor belt, the thickest steel ever mounted on a warship, was shattered. The watertight bulkheads designed to isolate damage were blown out like paper walls. The ship began to list again, and this time there were no more compartments to flood. There was nothing left to trade for time. On the bridge, the scene was one of quiet madness. Admiral Ito sat in his chair. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He watched the horizon tilt. The ocean was coming up to meet him. The captain of the ship, Captain Aruga, tied himself to the binnacle, the stand that holds the ship's compass. He was securing himself to the ship, literally and spiritually. He would not be leaving. At 2 o'clock, the list reached 20 degrees, then 30. The men on the deck began to slide. It wasn't a panic. It was gravity. Equipment that wasn't bolted down, crates, shell casings, bodies, began to tumble toward the port rail. The order to abandon ship was never officially given over the loudspeakers because the loudspeakers were dead. It was passed by shouting, from man to man, "Get out! Go! Into the water!" But how do you escape a skyscraper that is falling over? The men tried to climb up the sloping deck toward the starboard side, which was rising high into the air. It was like climbing a steel cliff covered in oil. They slipped. They clawed at rivets. They formed human chains pulling each other up. And then the electricity failed. Deep inside the ship, the lights died. The emergency lamps had already been smashed or exhausted. Thousands of men were plunged into absolute suffocating darkness, and the ship continued to roll. This is the moment where physics turns into horror. As the Yamato rolled onto her side, the internal geography changed. Corridors that were horizontal became vertical shafts. Doors became trapdoors in the floor or unreachable hatches in the ceiling. Men were falling through the darkness, tumbling down stairwells, crashing into bulkheads. And then the bow went under. The massive bulbous bow, the pride of the engineers, dipped beneath the surface, and the water began to pour into the main hull not through holes, but through the top. The ocean rushed into the casemates, the hatchways, the ventilation shafts, and this is where the screaming began. It is a sound that has haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives. It wasn't just the sound of men, it was the sound of the ship itself. As the water rushed in, it trapped massive pockets of air inside the hull. As the ship sank deeper, the water pressure increased. The air was compressed. It had nowhere to go. It was forced through narrow vents, through cracks in the steel, through the whistle tubes. The ship became a massive, dying organ. It emitted a high-pitched shrieking sound, a moan of escaping air that sounded undeniably, terrifyingly human. But mixed with that mechanical shriek were the actual voices. The escort destroyers drifting nearby, helpless to intervene, reported hearing it. Across the open water, over the sound of the wind and the waves, they heard a collective cry. It was the sound of hundreds of men trapped in the air pockets below deck, realizing that the water was rising, the air was compressing, and the light was never coming back. The acoustics of the steel hull amplified it. The water carried it. It was a chorus of the damned, broadcast to the indifference of the sea. At 2:23 p.m., the Yamato rolled completely over. She was upside down. Her massive keel, red with anti-fouling paint, broke the surface like the back of a whale. The propellers, still spinning in the empty air, churned the sky. For a moment she hung there. A pause, a breath. And then the magazines let go. The shells for the main guns, thousands of pounds of high explosives, tumbled out of their racks. They crashed into the bulkheads. They crashed into each other. A spark, a friction fire. The explosion was not just a bang, it was a geological event. It tore the ship in half. A pillar of fire shot 6,000 feet into the air. It was a mushroom cloud, so large and so high that it was seen by observers on the island of Kagoshima, 120 miles away. They thought a new type of weapon had been used. The shockwave killed men in the water who had managed to swim hundreds of yards away. Their internal organs were ruptured by the pressure wave moving through the sea. The heat was so intense, it singed the eyebrows of sailors on the destroyers miles away. The Yamato, the greatest ship ever built, the symbol of an empire, the dream of a nation, vaporized. One moment, there was a mountain of steel. The next, there was only a cloud of smoke and a hole in the ocean. Falling debris, chunks of steel the size of houses, rained down from the sky for minutes afterward. The sea boiled. The oil burned on the surface, creating a black, sticky shroud over the grave. And then slowly the smoke cleared. The fire died down. The screaming stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. It was the silence of absence. 72,000 tons of displacement gone. 3,000 lives gone. The sea rushed in to fill the void. It swirled and eddied, calming itself, returning to its flat, indifferent grey. The heavenly operation was over. The god had fallen. And all that was left were a few hundred heads bobbing in the oil, choking on the fumes, looking at the empty space where their world used to be. They were alone. The myth was dead, and the ocean, as it always does, went back to work, hiding the evidence. Imagine floating in a sea that has turned against you. The water is no longer blue, it is black. A thick, viscous sludge of heavy fuel oil covers the surface for miles. It coats your eyes, it fills your ears, it burns your throat when you try to breathe. For the 276 men who were pulled from the water that afternoon, survival did not feel like a victory. It felt like a clerical error. They drifted in groups, clinging to pieces of timber, crates, and the floating bodies of their friends. The silence that followed the great explosion was broken only by the retching of men swallowing oil and the soft weeping of those who had lost their minds. And then a sound rose up from the oil slick. It was faint at first, then stronger, singing. In the middle of that black hell, a group of sailors, blinded and burned, began to sing the Umi Yukuba. The sea goes, "It is a song of total submission to the emperor. If I go away to the sea, I shall be a corpse washing up." They sang it not as a protest and not as a celebration. They sang it because it was the only thing left that made sense. Their world, the steel world of the Yamato, was gone. The only thing remaining was the ideology that had put them there. When the destroyers finally moved in to pick them up, the scenes were grotesque. Men were so slippery with oil, they couldn't be gripped. Sailors on the rescue ships had to lean over the rails with boat hooks and grab the survivors by their belts, hauling them up like wet cargo. There were no cheers as they flopped onto the steel decks. The survivors didn't look at their rescuers. They looked at the floor. They huddled together, shivering, looking like statues carved from obsidian. They were the men who had floated away from the apocalypse. And in their hearts a heavy, toxic thought began to take root. Why me? Why am I here breathing air, when the best of us are down there in the dark? This is the burden of the survivor. To live is to have failed the dead. As the destroyers turned back toward Japan, leaving the empty circle of ocean behind, the heavenly operation dissolved into a terrestrial secret. The empire could not admit that its god was dead. When the survivors reached the naval base at Sasebo, they were not sent home. They were not given leave to comfort their families. They were quarantined. They were locked in barracks, isolated from the rest of the Navy, and forbidden to speak to anyone. The government of Japan was terrified. If the public knew that the Yamato, the invincible, unsinkable spirit of the nation, had been destroyed in less than 2 hours by enemy planes, the will to fight might collapse completely. So the silence began. Families of the crew received telegrams that were masterpieces of evasion. Died in action in the area of the South Seas. No ship name, no date, no details, just a void where a husband or a son used to be. For months, the ghost of the Yamato lingered in the national consciousness. People whispered. Rumors circulated that she was damaged, that she was hiding in a secret cove, that she was preparing for the final defense of Tokyo. But the ship was already dissolving. When the war ended in August 1945, the quarantine was lifted, and the survivors walked back into a country that had been leveled. Their cities were ash. Their navy was scrap metal. And the story they carried, the story of the screaming air and the pillars of fire, was a story nobody wanted to hear. Post-war Japan was busy trying to forget. They were rebuilding. They were writing a new constitution. They were trying to become a nation of peace and industry. The Yamato was an embarrassing reminder of a fever dream. It was a symbol of the hubris that had led them to ruin. So, the survivors learned to keep their mouths shut. They became salarymen. They became farmers. They built cars and radios. They raised children who knew nothing of the oil and the fire. But trauma does not respect silence. It waits. In the late 1970s and early 80s, as the generation that fought the war began to age, the silence cracked. A few diaries were published. A few interviews were given. The book Requiem for Battleship Yamato by Yoshida Mitsuru, a survivor who had been a radar officer, became a sensation. Suddenly the screams were audible again. Yoshida wrote with a brutal, poetic honesty. He described the smell of burning flesh. He described the officers drinking whiskey as the water rose. He described the moment the bow went under. Japan was forced to look in the mirror. They had to confront the fact that they had sent 3,000 men on a meaningless suicide mission, fueled by pride and a lack of fuel. And then they went looking for the body. In the 1980s, and again in 1999, deep-sea expeditions were launched to find the wreck. They had the coordinates. They had the sonar. The ocean floor in that part of the East China Sea is about 1,100 feet down. It is a zone of perpetual darkness. The pressure is crushing. When the lights of the submersibles finally cut through the gloom, they didn't find a ship. They found a crime scene. The Yamato lies on the bottom in pieces. The violence of her death is written in the steel. The main hull is upside down. A massive, rusted hill rising from the silt. But the bow, that famous bulbous bow, is sheared off completely. It lies a distance away, resting on its side, like a severed head. The most chilling discovery was the condition of the hull. It is ripped open, peeled back like the skin of an orange. This confirms the survivor accounts of the magazine explosion. The ship didn't just sink, it detonated. The camera drones glided silently over the wreckage. They passed the massive propellers, now encrusted with sea life. They passed the empty sockets where the anti-aircraft guns used to be. They found boots. They found porcelain dishes. They found the chrysanthemum seal, the gold emblem of the emperor, still attached to the bow, though tarnished and covered in gloom. But the wreck tells us something else. It tells us about the physics of the end. The debris field is vast, it covers miles. This indicates that the ship was tearing itself apart while it was still falling through the water column. As it sank, the heavy turrets fell out. The superstructure collapsed. The explorers found no bones. The ocean is efficient. Calcium dissolves at that depth, and the sea creatures do the rest. The 3,000 men have become part of the water. They are gone. But in the video feeds from those robots, hovering over the rust, we find a strange kind of peace. The violence is over. The fire is out. The steel is slowly returning to the earth from which it was mined. Yet as we stare at the images of that broken giant, we have to ask ourselves, why does this story still haunt us? Why do we care about a Japanese battleship from 80 years ago? It is not because of the size. We have built bigger ships since then. It is not because of the tragedy. We have seen worse slaughters. It is because Yamato is a perfect mirror for a specific human failure. We are a species that loves to build unsinkable things. We build systems, financial systems, political systems, technological systems, that we believe are too big to fail. We convince ourselves that if we make the walls thick enough, if we make the guns big enough, if we gather enough data, we can control the future. The Yamato was the ultimate expression of this delusion. It was a machine built to freeze time. It was an attempt to win a war of the future using the logic of the past. The designers thought that armor could defeat physics. The admirals thought that spirit could defeat radar. They were wrong. When we hear the stories of the crew screaming as the bow went under, we are not just hearing the death of sailors. We are hearing the sound of reality crashing into myth. We are hearing the moment when technology outruns belief. Think about our world today. We are building our own Yamatos. We pour trillions into weapons systems designed for wars that may never happen, while ignoring the threats that are actually at our door. We build economic empires that we claim are invincible, right up until the moment the torpedo strikes. We are no smarter than the men in the smoke-filled rooms of 1937. We just have better computers. The story of the Yamato is a warning. It warns us that size is not safety. It warns us that secrecy is not security. And it warns us that when you place your faith in a machine, you must be prepared to die inside it. The final verdict on the Yamato is not military. It is philosophical. The ship did not fail because the steel was weak. It did not fail because the sailors were cowardly. They were devastatingly brave. It failed because it was an answer to a question that nobody was asking anymore. It was a sword in the age of the gun. It was a castle in the age of the airplane. And the sea? The sea does not care about our metaphors. If you go to the coordinates today, 30 degrees north, 128 degrees east, you will see nothing. The water is grey and choppy. The wind blows from the west. The fishing boats come and go. The ocean has healed the wound. It has swallowed the oil. It has dispersed the smoke. It has silenced the screams. The sea is the ultimate editor of human history. It takes our grandest ambitions, our loudest shouts, our most terrible machines, and it turns them into rust and silence. But deep down, in the dark, the steel is still there. It is waiting, not for a rescue. It is too late for that. It is waiting for us to understand the lesson. We build our towers, we launch our ships, we declare our invincibility, and the ocean just waits. It knows that eventually the fuel will run out, the lights will flicker, and the bow will dip beneath the waves. The Yamato is not just a lost ship. It is a monument to the moment we realized that no matter how much armor we wrap ourselves in, we are all just drifting on the surface of a very deep, very cold, and very indifferent sea. Listen closely to the silence. That is the only truth that remains.